Okay, this is the point at which I finished discussing in the last video, reaching the desired driving injection quantity, or IQ. And I won't go into how we got there because obviously I've just talked about that on the previous video. Having got that value, we can't just use that value, because if we did, we would have no way of knowing if there was the right amount of air to burn the fuel, and all sorts of other complicated bits and bobs to do with the ECU would just get totally confused. So before this desired driving injection quantity can become a real desired driving injection quantity, if you've been looking at the maps, you obviously know it's got to go through a whole load of other maps to be tweaked and changed. There will be a MAF or a map or a lambda based smoke limitation of some description which will knock this driving desired IQ down to a smoke limited IQ. So in other words, limited by the amount of available air. Now, people often don't take this into account when they're looking at this, but basically boost pressure and boost limitation are the same thing. They are really part of the smoke limitation, because if you get the boost mapping wrong, then the smoke limitation maps won't work properly anyway. So this really has to include the boost limitation and the boost maps as well. So you've got a whole chunk of information and maps all adjusting this desired driving IQ. So once we get to here, we've got our limited injection quantity. Before we can get to our desired driving injection quantity, we've got to go through another limitation. The torque limiter will once again adjust whatever figure that this one is allowed to pass and adjust it down again. So we might have asked for 80 milligrams, let's say, of fuel here. This might well have knocked it down to 70 milligrams of fuel by making the decision that there's not enough air for 80. And when we get to here, the torque limiter might have knocked it down to 60 milligrams of fuel, working on the assumption that we were asking too much from the torque. In other words, what we were likely to get as a result of that was a less pleasant drive and possibly a damaged gearbox or a clutch. Now, that doesn't mean that that's what would happen, but it means that's what the designers of these files were thinking about, and obviously they want the car to last long enough for the customers to be happy. So now we've got our value after the torque limitation, so we've arrived at a final desired driving injection quantity. So we've got a figure that we can use, and you'd think that that would be it, but it isn't it, because Bosch and VW look at this and they say to themselves, let's make this as nice an experience as possible, because while all these numbers are churning around inside the ECU, there is always the likelihood that, because we're dealing with a mechanical object, that this driving IQ will not be reflected as a beautifully smooth, perfect series of numbers, but it will vary slightly. And in which case you might feel that when you're driving, you might feel a tendency for the engine to want to surge ahead or hold back, even though you've got the pedal held at one particular point. And so what they do is they build in maps which are for surge damping. In other words, that smooths out any peaks or troughs in the injection quantity. So the injection quantity might be wiggling up and down like this as you were driving along, but you won't notice, because the value that's actually getting past this point will either be perfectly smooth, or it will just have some nice smooth little wiggles in it that you're not going to notice. So it improves the quality of the driving experience. You don't feel any sort of jerking or surging of the engine. Now, they could stop there, but the designers have gone one step further, especially with the PD injectors, because with PD injectors, they can measure when each injector fires, and so they can then measure how long the injector fires for, and as a result of that, they can get a pretty good idea of how much fuel went in exactly and how much force was put onto the piston to spin the engine round, because they can measure what the revs per minute are doing. Now this means that if you've got a bit of a cylinder imbalance and one cylinder perhaps kicks a little bit harder or a little bit softer than the others, or maybe two of them kick reasonably okay but two are different to the other two, you might just feel that as a slightly lumpy tick over or a slightly less smooth journey when you're driving, especially with cruise control perhaps engaged. And so what would happen at this point is these injection values for each individual cylinder, they are being balanced as close as possible so that each cylinder is producing the same engine revs per minute as if it was on its own. And if that is as close as possible to a match for all four cylinders, then the engine will run very, very smoothly. And so that's what they do there. They smooth out the running of the engine as best they can. Now, I just mentioned cruise control, and that is something that's not represented on here. But of course, cruise control is another factor that can interfere with all of this. So in other words, there could be another box over here saying cruise control, because cruise control can obviously take over the desired driving injection quantity, in the sense that once you've reached a point that you are perfectly comfortable with, you can toggle a little switch and then the ECU decides that those values are accepted, and it will stick with those until some other circumstance changes. You dip the clutch, touch the brake, touch the accelerator or whatever. So there is in effect another set here of what you might call limitations, except in this case they're not, are they? They're sort of like smooth running inputs, but from you the driver, because you're the one in control of the switch. Right, so we finally got an accepted driving injection quantity. And if I talk a little bit about the SEAT Leon file that I've been using for a lot of these videos, it was noticeable that when you got to this sort of area, 60 milligrams was about the maximum fuel per stroke, so the maximum injection quantity at 5,000 revs per minute. Now, for a variety of reasons, if you're going to talk about this sort of thing, it's usually best to talk about maximum values, because they are some of the few values where you can pin them down and say, that's the value. It's quite difficult to pin down other values with engines, as designers will tell you. So the max values from wide open throttle on 60 milligrams and 5,000 revs per minute are probably the best place to start looking. So I'm going to use that as my fixed point to continue talking this through. And once again, I'm going to stop there because, like I said, I want to keep these videos at a sensible length so that people watching them don't tear their hair out listening to my voice.